Hello, and welcome to Bad Transportation Math versus the Speed of Plot. With me today is a wonderful group of panelists, Ken Schrader, Julayne Hughes, Mark Van Name, and Catherine Asaro. And in a minute, we're going to have them introduce themselves and give you a lot of good information on both how to avoid kicking your readers out of the plot by virtue of your bad transportation map, and also some of their own rather interesting stories in that regard. But before we get to the meat of the panel, I've got some administrative announcements. First, as you know, this panel is being recorded. It will be available sometime within the next month on the Balticon YouTube channel. Keep checking the Balticon website to make sure that you know when it's live. Also, if you want to ask a question, because you can do that in Zoom, you need to go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, at which point a pane will pop up. You can type into that. I plan to take questions in the second half of the panel, but I will be looking at the questions throughout the panel. If you are calling in via dial-in, and we have had some folks doing dial-in, the key to use is *9, and then some prompts will lead you through the rest of the process. Okay, time to get started. Would you all introduce yourselves? Catherine?
Hi, my name's Catherine Asaro. I write mostly science fiction, some fantasy. I'm a physicist, a theoretical physicist by training, and I just saw one of my former students logged in.
Oh, cool.
So I do a lot with the physics of space travel. I love it. It's like a puzzle to solve. And I've won some awards. I won the Nebula a couple times. I even hit a few bestseller lists, but not lately. That's me. Oh, I have to say, I have a new book coming out July 7th, and I lost it. I'll show it later, but I will put up my website.
Okay, and we will be putting up our websites in the comments section for all panelists and attendees, in case you like what you hear. Okay, Mark.
My name is Mark Van Name. I write primarily science fiction novels, a couple dozen short stories, a little bit of fantasy, but no fantasy books. And I've also made my living as a tech journalist for a long time, but I've worked in computer tech my whole career.
Okay, cool. Julayne.
I am Jillaine Hughes. I am a freelance writer and editor. I write short stories in speculative fiction, so I kind of go across genres. And pertinent to this particular panel, I also have a math degree, and I currently crunch numbers in institutional research at a small private college.
Cool. Ken?
Hi, my name's Ken Schrader. I write science fiction, fantasy, weird westerns, though not necessarily in that order. I'm a massive fan of the Oxford comma, and though my background doesn't quite show it, I make housing decisions based on the space available for bookshelves.
Oh dear. I think we all do that. Anyway, okay, y'all write sci-fi, y'all write fantasy, and I gotta confess, when they asked me to moderate this panel, my first thought was, well, but when you've got faster than light drive and teleportation devices and space dilation, how could anything you do with transportation, moving your people through space, really kick anybody out of the plot? How does it matter when you can defy physics? Okay, Julayne. I know everybody's going to yell at me for this, so go right ahead.
That's all right. That's all right. How many of the laws of physics you want to bend really depends on the kind of world that you want to build. However, you have to make sure you remain consistent within your own world and the rules that you've built for it. For instance, if you have chosen to write a sci-fi that is very much like the physics of our own universe, then you just might need to think about the law of relativity, and you might need to think about how much time it might take to get from here to Alpha Centauri. And even if you're transporting someplace to another place on the planet, you may have to think about things like sunrises and sunsets, moon phases, and all kinds of stuff like that that you might not normally think about just when you're trying to write a good story.
Okay, Mark?
I think sort of the literal answer to your question is, if there's a way to mess up, we can find it. People in general, authors in particular. But I still think that the greatest challenge is managing time versus plot, because long time delays decrease tension. Plot tends to work best with increasing tension. So if you're going to have long periods of time between significant events, you've got to find a way to keep the tension up. Otherwise, the story doesn't tend to read as compellingly. And, you know, it's like why in a detective story, somebody gets in a fight that would normally take them 6 weeks in a hospital to heal, and instead they're up an hour later, because if the mystery sits cold for 6 weeks, the whole world has moved on a lot. We as readers are not very excited to read about his day in and day out, or her day in and day out time in the hospital. So I think the greatest challenge is managing time versus tension.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that a little bit of fudging is okay as long as it's ramping up the narrative tension.
What I hope you do in science fiction is set up your technology and your rules so that you don't break them, but then you structure for tension within them.
Okay, Ken?
Yeah, to piggyback on what Julayne was saying, consistency is key. Once you understand how your world works, I mean, even if you're, even if you're doing really, really far out stuff, the rules have to stay the same regardless of where it is that you're at. Myself, even when I've got ships traveling, faster than light, my assumption is that time is the same everywhere. So I don't necessarily worry about the distances that I'm covering, is because for the purpose of the story, the distances don't really matter. It's more about the characters and what they're doing in between point A and point B.
Okay. Catherine, I know you're going to beat me up. I'm looking forward to it. Tell us why it matters.
Well, we have a lot of leeway in science fiction and fantasy because we can set things up to suit our plot. For example, I write, in the future. Mm-hmm. So yeah, my character, in fact, I really like that Mark brought up about mysteries, because my latest are science fiction mysteries. And the character does get injured. Somebody's trying to kill her. And there wouldn't be much tension of the plot if she lies around for 6 weeks recovering. But the medical advances are enough that, and what you have to do is make sure that you design, for example, the injury that the person gets to fit with the medical level that you've picked for your world building, so that they can get better fairly soon. Mm-hmm. Even if they're close to death, there are certain ways that are easier to fix, and probably in the future will be, I should say in the future will be easier to fix. Mm-hmm. So there's that. But the other thing is space travel. And I love it because, I'm a physicist, right?
Yeah.
So I play with all the relativistic stuff. Like time dilation, if you go close to the speed of light, time passes at a different rate for you than an observer watching you from the planet. So you may age more slowly, say, than the people on the planet. And when you're writing a space battle, it's really fascinating problem to work out, because you're working in a 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional, counting time, arena. It's not like 2-dimensional like it is on the ground. You've got space contraction or rotation, you've got time dilation, you have all these effects that you have to think about. Mm-hmm. However, I like to do it because, I'm a nerd. I admit it. I love that stuff. But if you're going to do it, you have to do it. Either you need to figure it out yourself or have someone check it. I get asked a lot to check people's work. John Henry and I had a long discussion about, he has his wonderful books called, he writes under the name of Oh, now I'm drawing a
Jack
blank.
Campbell. Jack
The
Campbell.
Jack Campbell books, yeah, right. But I'm drawing a blank on the name he writes them under.
Yeah, well, John Henry is Jack Campbell, and I think he writes the ones that are based on Anabasis.
No, Jack Campbell, the character.
Oh,
But anyway, the point is either if you know how to work it out, work it out. If you don't know how to work it out, get help from someone who does. If you don't want to do either of those things, and you don't have to tell a good story, just don't do it halfway. Because if you do it halfway and make mistakes, that is what pulls the reader out of it.
mm-hmm.
You know, if you say, well, they went at this portion of the speed of light and it took them this long to get there, and that's wrong, that's going to pull the reader out more than if you just do what Ken was talking about, which is say, you know, time passed.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, choose it carefully. Either do it in detail to get all the time right, or just, you know, you can just say time passed. That's not wrong.
Well, doesn't delay, though, create some, and this is for all the panel, you know, we're talking about needing to move the plot along, but doesn't the fact that they are fighting a delay sometimes add to the tension? You know, the whole thing of you've got a plague, sorry, gang, but you've got a plague or a disaster on planet X, and you've got the antidote or the machinery that they need on planet Y, and the fact that it's taking them time to get to planet X, isn't that itself a ramping up the tension? And, you know, and way of ramping up the tension.
Yeah. And when I do stuff like that, I mean, I have it worked out so why there is a delay. I mean, I wrote a paper on this inversion drive that mathematically it's a way to circumvent the speed of light. Okay, it only works mathematically, but the American Journal of Physics published it with the understanding that I said it was a thought game, a thought experiment.
Cool.
And so, yeah, there are limitations on how fast you can do it, which work well for building that kind of tension. But if you're not going to, you know, you shouldn't have to write a paper published in the American Journal of Physics to tell a science fiction story. If you don't want to do that, I think the word that people have been using in this panel is consistency. As long as you set out your rules, this is how long it takes, and be consistent with those, I think the reader usually will accept that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. For the other panelists, who I presume do not have physics degrees like me, how far do you go down the rabbit hole of your research into these things?
In terms of how long it takes to get
From point A to
actually,
point B.
let me step back a little bit and say that mathematics and I,
Mm-hmm.
we have a very, very strained relationship, let's say.
Oh, okay.
We don't cross the same edges of the street at, you know, if we meet each other on the road. It's all weird. So again, I don't pay any attention to that in terms of, okay, if it takes 12 hours to get from planet A to planet B, you know, to, you know, stop an attack or whatever, then that's what I keep in my head. I know how far away planet A and planet B are from each other. It takes 12 hours to get there. So so regardless of wherever else I am in the universe, that distance takes that time, period. And it keeps me from having to burn out brain cells trying to figure out, you know, time dilation and stuff like that. I don't sit there and detail all the 12 hours of that trip. Generally, there will be maybe no more than a single chapter in between the start and the end where it's all about ramping up that tension. You know, let's outline the plans, let's brace for impact sort of thing. And then at the end of that chapter, bam, you're there and off you go.
Okay. Jillaine?
Well, I think what I tend to look for are things that are sort of not quite my pet peeves, but my interests. For instance, my favorite books of all time is Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. But having said that, it drives me bananas when they are walking on the west side of mountains and then an east wind comes and it's a cold wind. When anybody who has any kind of weather knowledge knows that a wind that's coming down mountains warms as it goes down. So I have to excuse him though, because he lived in England where an east wind meant it was coming off the North Sea. So it was cold. So I get where that idea came from, but as far as being meteorologically accurate, it's not. So, but that just happens to be a thing of mine that I would notice. I also love to pay attention to things like time zones and moon phases and sunrises and and tides. Those kinds of things. Maybe it's the numbers. Maybe I don't know. But those things fascinate me. So those are the things that I tend to notice if an author gets it wrong.
Yeah, Mark.
I think that you need to do enough research to know all your rules so that you stay within them. And in some cases, that's relatively straightforward to do. In some cases, I think you have to do a lot of work or not use that system of rules. If you're trying to stay within known science, you should do enough research to make sure you know at least the fundamentals of the science. And if you're inventing something new or doing your own take on a classic trope, like in my novels, I have these jump gates that appear, and each one connects 2 points in space-time, and you traverse through them instantly. But for the particular model that I was using, which was feudal Europe, I made it so that no energy can pass through on its own. So physical objects pass through, they carry information through them, and that means it's basically a token-based information system instead of a always connected network like we have with the internet. That was an intentional choice, and I constructed the rules around that. I think you've got to figure out what you want to accomplish and do enough research to have the science right for that and have all your rules laid out, because I do think that you owe the reader not breaking your own rules. That I think is that consistency, which Catherine mentioned again, and we keep coming back to, is important, because otherwise, as a writer, you'll just start making things up, and magic plot will happen, and none of your plot will make sense, and your characters will constantly be being saved by things that you invent that really shouldn't be there.
Okay. Speaking of magic, and we talked in the prequel to the panel about hand-wavium science, all of you write fantasy as well as sci-fi, and fantasy frequently has a problem with things, especially fantasies that are set in worlds less industrialized than ours, where people have horses running 200 miles in a day. Running, and anybody who's ever known a horse knows that if you can get them to run 10 minutes, you're doing good, and it's dangerous for the horse, actually, and the horse is more valuable than you are. But basically, in fantasy, how do you, make sure that your people, your characters, your beings are moving at a reasonable speed? How do you research and make sure that they get from point A to point B in a reasonable amount of time? And what kind of research do you do to make that happen? Mark, we're talking, we'll go back with you for now.
Very much in fantasy, either you invent transportation modes that are faster, or your plot has to take the time into account, and it's going to take a really long time. So either deal with things that are very close, or invent faster transportation. We can fly, you have to figure out the energy. I at least feel obliged to figure out the energy sources for any flying creature and how many calories they're likely to burn and that kind of thing. So, but mostly what I do to avoid those problems is try and have nearby settings so that you can keep the story moving along.
Proximity is your friend, in other words.
Proximity and time compression.
Yeah. Catherine?
I think
it depends how urgent you want it to be. I don't mind it taking time to do things. I just don't want to spend that time twiddling my thumbs as a reader.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there are times when I've jumped months ahead in the plot from the end of one chapter to the beginning of the next chapter.
Mm-hmm.
I think as long as the reader knows what you're doing, they're willing to accept that. There is a certain limitation on that, because if the tension in the story is the time itself, then that sort of takes attention out. But a lot of times it's not. And I think you're absolutely right that it pulls the reader out more to have it happen too fast. Like, you know, I really like, say, the Aladdin movies, okay? And they're zipping around on this magic carpet, right? But really, it's not. I mean, there'd be all this wind and they'd fall off the carpet, you know? And they can't get there that fast. But we're willing to accept it because we're willing to suspend belief. I think when we write, you know, as a movie, and a movie that's a family Disney, you know, oriented more toward children as well as adults, we're more willing to accept it as part of the fantasy. When we're writing a book, I think, especially an adult or even YA, I mean, these young kids are very sharp. You know, we need to at least make a nod to the amount of time. So that means doing some research to figure out how long does it take you to get from Escondido, California to, you know, Oregon, Seattle, or, you know, Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And then just say the time passed.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to show them going.
Okay. Julayne, what do you do to make sure that your fantasy obeys the necessary, you know, laws of time and travel, so that you don't have your characters going from point A to point B at the speed of teleportation if they don't have that capability, or that they don't look ridiculous either in their amount of time, too much time, too little time? How do you manage that?
My favorite tool to keep track of all that is just a spreadsheet. And that, then I can put down timelines, and this is how much distance between this and that, this is how they traveled, this is how many miles or how many leagues or however, insert unit of measure here. And so I use a spreadsheet to keep track of all that. And to figure out how long it should take, I kind of went to a bunch of different sources to find that information. I have been to like survivalist websites that can tell me how long it takes to walk a mountainous terrain 10 miles, because that's going to be way different than somebody walking 10 miles across a plain. Mm-hmm. So, and you can look at military stuff. There are just all kinds of research out there that you can look up just how long it takes a person or a unit of people to get from point A to point B. And another thing I realized too is what really opened up my eyes to it was going to Europe for the first time back in 1984. I discovered that 200 miles in Europe is not the same as 200 miles in the United States.
No.
And why is that? Because the layout of the roads is completely different. They had everything set up before there was the kind of mass transportation that we have now that's faster than horses. So, and even between the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States, you can see that difference. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, in colonial times, the East Coast had a certain way of going places and doing things, where out in the plains, you can make really good time. 10 hours can take you 600 miles, where on the East Coast, 10 hours might take you 10 miles, depending on what kind of traffic jam you're in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, yeah. Well, we've all been on the beltway around Baltimore when something's gone down, and it's like, we ain't getting there from here. Ken?
Let's see. We're drifting dangerously close to numbers again. So what I do is I'll specify the distance, and I'll do this one of two, and I'll handle the travel one of two ways. One, way back right around 2nd edition D&D, I had my party of characters get from one place to another by handing them essentially this massive stack of run scrolls. and you just go, 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 go. And that addition, there wasn't a whole lot of cost to magic. So it was just like, and I love the visual of these guys in armor just sprinting across the countryside. Which sort of leads me to the other method that I would use, and that's the method they used in like Conan the Barbarian. I mean, Conan and Subutai, those guys ran everywhere, but the world didn't feel small. And you knew it took forever, but it didn't matter, you know, that how long it took for them to get to where they were going. And all you had was traveling music and a little, you know, a couple of montages of them running. So in this case, if I've got a ticking clock, one, I'll give them a reasonable amount of speed. And then during that time, I will interlace that with character moments. You know, again, we're laying plans. We're worried about what we're going to find at the end. Or I have a better plan. No, this plan is going to work. We're going to stick with that. Internal conflict, character moments, and I'll use that to bridge the gap between point A and point B, because really I myself as a writer, I'm not interested in the details and getting from point A to point B.
Okay, cool. So I'm curious, you know, Julayne raised something and you were talking about spreadsheets. And I was wondering, how many of you all do concurrent timelines for your characters? I confess, I'm a Virgo. I do concurrent timelines. Does anybody else do that?
Is it okay if I answer?
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the idea of spreadsheets, but it's slightly different, I think, than the timeline you're talking about. You can tell me if this is answering it or not. I do spreadsheets to work out all the times because I create solar systems, I create worlds, star systems. So how long does it take the planet to go around the sun? To figure that out, you have to know how far it is from the sun or the star, which means you have to know what type of star it is. There's a lot of details. How long does it rotate? So how long is a day? I keep all that stuff in spreadsheets, details about the light incident on the planet, the length of a season, how much tilt you have to the planet so you know what happens to your season, the length of a year. You know, and that's a lot of work. There is a book which I would like to tell people about that I use to help me calculate all this, because the author is Stan Schmidt, who was the editor of Analog magazine for many, many, many years. And he lays out in very simple, straightforward detail how you figure out all this stuff. And the name of the book is Aliens and Alien Societies. And the author is Stan Schmidt.
Okay.
And I recommend that highly because it's very straightforward. You don't have to be a math genius or have a doctorate or, you know, any of that to understand what he's talking about.
Cool. Could you type that into the chat when, you know, we move on to the other panelists on this one?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Great. So that the folks can, yeah. Okay, Julayne, do you use your spreadsheets in that fashion, or are you just basically tracking how people move and whether or not, I was doing this for a story recently, did the amount of conversation I have give another set of characters in a different place too much time or not enough time to do what they needed to do? Do you do that sort of thing?
Yeah, I do that because now if I were doing more of the sort of hard sci-fi that Catherine is talking about, where we're on different worlds and different solar systems, then I'm sure I would probably do that sort of thing. But I cheat and keep it on Earth. So, so that way it's a lot easier to calculate, and maybe Ken would find that much easier too. I don't know. But anything that has to do with numbers that I can keep track of on a spreadsheet, I do it.
Okay. Ken, what about timelines, if not spreadsheets and math?
You had me at less calculations. I am actually in the book that I'm working on now. I am working with multiple points of view, and I'm not putting everything down on a spreadsheet, but there's one point of view that is a unspecified on purpose length of time behind the primary point of view, because they're talking about what just happened. So they're a little bit behind. And what I'm working on doing is shrinking that time frame gradually till the point where towards the end of the book, they're all operating in the same time. And that's when the massive fight happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's in draft form right now, so I don't know if it's actually going to work as well as I think it is currently. We'll wait till I'm done, let it sit, and then read it and see.
Mm-hmm.
But that's currently what I'm doing. And in terms of keeping track of all of that, I'll make notes to myself. And I use Scrivener to write with, and there's a never-ending supply of note cards there. So I'll leave notes for myself to remind me just how far back this character is from everybody else. And as I said, I'm gradually shrinking it, and we'll see if it works.
Okay, so yeah, you are using a method of organization there, despite the distaste for math. Mark, do you use spreadsheets, timelines to track things to keep them
Sort of,
consistent?
but I tend to write first person narration or close in on the main character. I'm fascinated by stories as they happen to individuals and tend not to write an overview where I'm talking about multiple characters at the same time. So I'm particularly fascinated by history as experienced by individuals as opposed to history written as an overview.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that I have to know, and I do track what's happening in other planets and other places as my character progresses, but the character only knows what's happening to him. And so for me, it's a different approach. I'm trying very much to write tight in on this character who is always surprised by things happening that we don't know about. And as readers, we don't know either until the character experiences them. But I'm at some point going to switch, I think, to writing some pieces that are more multiple point of view. And at that point, I think I'll have to have even more explicit timelines. Right now, I just have to know that by the time my character reaches a certain point, certain other things have happened in other worlds.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah, it's a balancing the act depending on what you're doing. Are there, one of the things that was asked in our Q&A, and I think that it's an appropriate insertion here, is we've talked about, getting it right, how important consistency is. We've talked about how we do it, and it mentioned a couple of things, like, Ken mentioning Conan, where it actually worked quite well, where folks managed the time of travel and did it so that it flowed seamlessly, even though it might not be the perfect in terms of accuracy. Do you all have, this is the question from James Thomas, what are some of the best and worst novels and movies in this regard? Movies and novels or TV shows that got the speed of transportation right, or the balance of the speed of transportation and plot right, and what are some that did it badly? Mark, do you have any that you would cite in this regard? Or do you want me to go to somebody else to come back?
I was just thinking, because honestly, most of the time I believe if we notice it, it means the storytelling has failed or they've just become egregious. And so just about any modern TV show or movie that involves a law enforcement agency is going to get time wrong. Blind Spot, for example, has the FBI says it's in Queens, and 2 minutes later they're in Queens from downtown New York.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever been to New York, maybe not even today, with no one on the road, or nobody should be on the road, can you go from Manhattan to Queens in 2 minutes? And so pretty much everybody compresses and cheats, I think, outside of science fiction. And a lot of science fiction ignores the relativity aspects entirely just to get up with it. But the Forever War, for example, Joe Haldeman's book, showing the effects on a relationship of the different aging and the different passage of time, I did a very nice job of that. And I think there are a lot of books in SF that do it well, but most non-SF doesn't.
Mm-hmm. So you think actually science fiction and fantasy are more attuned to that than mainstream or mystery or some other genres?
In general, I would say so. I mean, it's not to say we don't make plenty of mistakes and we don't cheat too, but I think that we at least know that our readers are going to be hip to it and they're going to be thinking about it. And other genres, I don't think take that care with it in general.
Okay. Catherine, are there any movies or novels that you think dealt with transportation, the speed of transportation and its realities well? And are there any that you went, oh God, no?
Well, you know, the one I was trying to reference before, it is the Jack Campbell books. They're called the Lost Fleet books.
Yeah.
And when John was first writing those, we were in for many years, we were in a workshop together. That was before I moved here to New York, where traffic goes nowhere. And I remember telling him, you know, relativistically, what's going on doesn't work in your space battles. And most of the time when I say that, people say, yeah, Catherine, go away. Because, you know, they say, look, I'm trying to tell a story. But, you know, he really listened and he really worked on it. And, you know, he talks about how long it takes. And it takes a long time. You don't fight a battle the same way in space. So, you know, I was sort of like the proud parent, you know. We're the same age, but, you know. So I would recommend those. The thing that really bugs me, it's related to this. It's not so much travel as the time it takes. I watch a lot of those crime procedurals too, because they're solving a problem, and they have that in common with science fiction. But anytime they have to do something, like I think it was Mark brought up, you know, they say, okay, I can hack this system, type. All right, I hacked it. Here's the information. I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way. It takes, like, you know, forever.
Or I can get the results of this particular forensic test in 15 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's not just that travel of a vehicle or a person, but it's how long it takes to do, you know, certain types of events. And granted, the plot would come to a screeching halt if they really showed how long it took. But I wish they would just cut away to some other part and then come back and imply that, you know, the time passed for them to do the work.
Yeah. Use that as, I believe it was Ken who was saying, use that as a moment to insert a character interaction.
Exactly.
Then, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Ken, what about you? Do you have any books, novels, movies where they did speed of transportation or speed of function, which is what we're getting at, correct? And did you, do you know any where they got it really, really laughably wrong?
All right. The examples I'm going to use of where they got it right are movies like The Cannonball Run or Gumball Rally, massive cross-continent races.
Right.
And they don't tell you at all how long it takes to get from point A to point B, because it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
All it matters is whether or not you got there first.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the movies themselves are just compilation of character moments that move, you know, that go back and forth from different drivers and things that they're doing. That's where the story is. And ultimately, yeah, we want to know who gets there first. But what they'll do is they'll compress that, you know, the idea of the entire race into like 9 or 10 blocks where they're actually driving, you know, physically driving these vehicles from point A to point B, and you see like the photo finish at the end. I don't think in either of those movies they even show a clock at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I know they showed one at the beginning of Gumball Rally, but again, I don't recall the time it took at the end. And for a movie that got it wrong, I think. I'm going to go controversial and say the original Star Wars.
Mhm.
How does the Death Star get from point A to point B without years? And I'm sure that there's, some sort of technical manual written after the fact that explain how the Death Star can achieve that kind of travel. But at the time, no, there's just no way. And you know what? It really doesn't matter, because by that point in the movie, I was hooked, and it did not care. And I think that's part of what we're all talking about here is when you're, as a writer, somebody picks up your book, they're giving you a certain amount of credit, say like $100, just to keep the math easy for me. And when you botch something, you lose like $10. So 10 failures in a row, and the person is essentially throwing the book across the room and you're done. But if you nail the little things, you're buying yourself extra bits of credit, so that when you and again, I was saying before the panel, I own stock in the Handwavium Corporation. So when I ask you to swallow something like faster than light travel, faster than light communication, I'm making sure that I've got the details that I can nail down, so that you're willing to go with me on that ride.
Mhm. Yeah. And that's the whole thing. You have to be willing to suspend disbelief, which is a fancy term, but really willing to go along with the creator on their ride. Jillaine, I'm sorry. How do you have any movies or novels that you'd like to point to? And
Well,
if you don't, that's okay. I got more questions.
I can't think of any specific movies or novels, but what I can think about is how movies and novels portray the use of technology.
Mhm.
I mean, it just kills me, for instance, in the Star Trek 4 movie, they have Scotty coming in on a 20th century computer, and after the funny part where he tries to talk to the computer and it doesn't work, and
Yes.
types away on the keyboard and all this stuff starts happening on the screen. It's like, come on, really? And even watching something as simple as War Games, you just look at that and you're not even shuddering at the old technology. You're just shuddering at, there's no way that this is going to be happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ironically enough, just as you were, I guess this was happening when you were talking about Star Wars, Ken, we have a question from James Thomas about Star Trek versus Star Wars in this regard. So what I'm hearing from Julayne is they're both equally bad or equally good, depending on how you wish to look at it. Do the rest of the panelists have a thought on this? Mark?
I like both series, but they're both pretty equally ridiculous in terms of time management. And I will say that at this point, there are so many Star Treks with so many timelines and so many jumps across the timelines that I think it's best to treat them all as if we're in a multiverse and magically they just hop among them, and try not to think very hard about anything else related to it, because their time management is just terrible. Doesn't make them not entertaining. It's, I love Discover, but they're constantly messing with it. So I think that's best where you just say, hey, it's magic science. They're going to get there when they want to get there. The giant ships will appear when they want to get there. And sometimes it takes one missile to take one down, and sometimes 1,000 missiles won't do it, and don't worry about it.
That's true.
Oh, and let's not even talk about Han Solo's 12 parsecs.
Yeah, we will not talk about that. Ken, do you find Star Trek any better than Star Wars in this regard or not?
No, for me, Star Wars light speed and Star Trek's warp speed, they're the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that, I could Google the difference between the two of them and get numbers, but again, numbers. Just in terms of functionality as a means to get from point A to point B, we're going really, really fast. That's all I need to know as a viewer. And granted, I've got the capacity to suspend disbelief that borders on being a superpower. So it takes a lot to knock me out of the story that way, but I do tend to bunch, ideas like that together. In my head canon, warp speed, light speed, they're the same.
Okay. Catherine, this one, I'm letting you go, and then I've got a question specifically for you from our audience. So, Star Trek, Star Wars, do either of them get it right, or is one
Well,
just as bad as the other?
Yeah, Star Wars doesn't try.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think that makes sense because they just say they went there and they don't tell us really how they, I mean, they wave, that they have a investment in the hand waving company. But, they don't try. And it has more of a fantasy feel, even though it's space adventure. Star Trek, like, the other panelists were saying, I think it was Mark who's saying it was all over the place. I mean, in some places, Vulcan has a year this length a day. In other timelines, it's got a different length. I mean, everything's different and it keeps changing. But in Star Trek, sometimes they try. They're all, like, if you look at the series, all the various series, sometimes they get the science pretty well. So a lot of times they don't. And sometimes they'll make an effort. And, I also agree with the idea that if you make an effort and you get some of it right, your audience is more willing to let the wonky stuff go. So, when Star Trek tries, like the trouble with Tribble, every number they give in that thing about the Tribbles and their multiplication, all of them that you get right on target for populations. So, they're different, but mostly in Star Trek, I don't think they really care. They say warp speed, and they never really define in detail how warp speed works.
Okay.
So, and they shouldn't, it's smart for them not to, because there's not that much for us to pull apart, right?
Yeah, that's true. Okay, we have a question for you from Bob Kanefsky for Catherine. In a non-TL book, I'm not sure I know what the acronym is, what are the implications of relative simultaneity on chapter ordering, on statements like, we were doing our first rocket launch while you were inventing steam engines. Also, while you were inventing the Model T. Also, well, we'll doing your rocket launch. I'm not quite sure I understand that question, but relative simultaneity appears to be the key phrase here.
Well, I'm not sure what TL book means.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, a non-FTL book. Oh, okay. I see. In relativistic physics, depending on how fast you're going, what looks to events that look like they're simultaneous to observers in different reference frames. And what I mean by reference frame is I may be going at a certain speed relative to you. I'm in a different reference frame. You're watching me and you see two events happen simultaneously. It doesn't necessarily happen simultaneously in a different reference frame to someone going at a different speed. If you're going fast enough, close to the speed of light, this is a real thing. It's not science fiction. And if I understand the question, he's saying, what happens if you ignore that and a lot of things are going? If it's not faster than light travel, but you have spaceships going at close to light speed, I mean, this is a brilliant, brilliant question, because that ship, if you go at a certain speed and you go to a planet and come back and you think it took you, say, 3 years, if you're going close enough to the speed of light, you could get back to Earth and find out, 100 years have passed, 1,000 years have passed. So what is simultaneous? What events are simultaneous? To really do that right, Ken, you're not going to like this. You need to do the math. You need to figure it out. And it's the equations for figuring, you can figure out when events happen simultaneously for who. You just using special relativity, which you only need once you've had first year math in college, you have enough math to do it.
Okay.
So I think I'm going over line.
Yeah, I'm having to do the math here and cut us off, but I just want everybody to repeat their websites. verbally, and to thank all of you beforehand for being great panelists, and thank you all for being a great audience and coming and joining us here today. So, Ken, what's your website?
You can find me at www.ken-schrader.com.
Okay. Julayne?
You can find me at Julayne.net, Julayne.net.
Okay. Mark?
markfanname.com.
Okay. Catherine?
CatherineAsaro.net. It's a brand new website.
Okay, great. And congratulations on the book coming up in July. I'm Jean Marie Ward. I write fiction, nonfiction, and everything in between. You can find me at jeanmarieward.com, and all of these websites are in the chat. Thank you for being a great audience, and thank you from Virtual Balticon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Can I put my Patreon page in chat?
Yep, go right ahead.
You can, but I do have to end the panel in just a few seconds.